Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm glad that you're all here for this last panel discussion in this year's Festival of Reconciliation. And in this panel discussion, we will discuss what happens when we face the fact that we are privileged in some way, and how facing privileges can elicit some kind of social change, or at least willingness to change. So first, let me introduce today's panelists, and then we can continue to the discussion. We have here Dr. Annom Kende, professor of social psychology at ELTE University in Budapest. Anna's research revolves around intergroup relations, mostly on prejudice and discrimination of minority groups, and the psychological underpinnings of social change. And Anna's recent research work has been focused on discrimination against Roma people in Central and Eastern Europe. Then we have Frank Eckerle. He's a psychologist, a research fellow at Philipps University Marburg. He studies psychology of privilege and allyship, primarily white privilege and male privilege, as well as topics on solidarity, collective action, and identity. And we have Majdom Hrženjak. She's a sociologist and research and a project leader at the Peace Institute in Ljubljana. Her research topics are gender studies and social politics, with a focus on the concept of care in relation to intersectional inequalities and the feminist ethic of care. So in the next hour and a half, we will discuss various aspects of privileges, what happens when we face our own privilege, and how becoming aware of our privileges can make us allies of unprivileged groups, and drive some kind of social change. And regarding the flow of the discussion, our panelists will discuss the topics from their perspectives, and then we will have some time for discussion and Q&A session. And just let me give a brief intro on privilege in general, so that we have the same starting point. We typically define privilege as a special advantage that is granted but not earned, and behind every privilege there is an imbalance of power, and thus privilege can be seen as a prerequisite for inequality, right? But also the consequence of inequality, so it seems to be a kind of a vicious cycle. And importantly, people who have privilege are usually unaware of it, whereas those who lack privilege are at higher risk of being perceived as incompetent individuals and not to be underprivileged, right? And their status is not always attributed to social issues, but sometimes to their personality. And research shows that it is not easy to accept that you're privileged yourself, and that people find various strategies to cope when they face their own privileges. And so let's talk about different aspects of confronting privileges and how it can help us to build a bit more equal society. So, Anna, I would like you to start. You have conducted plenty of studies about discrimination against Roma people and prejudice reduction strategies. And for me, the most interesting one was the study where you actually confronted the majority population with the majority members with the real-world experiences of Roma people minority. So that study with renting a flat, okay. That's one that I really found interesting. And so having that in mind, I would like you to tell us more about what happens when people face their own privilege and how we can utilize their reactions to make meaningful psychological interventions. And maybe would you like me to read you all three questions now, or
oh my God, no.
No, okay,
have a very hard time
then let's start with this one.
one.
So what happens when people face their own privilege, and how can we utilize them?
This is really difficult to start with, because I actually, so as a social psychologist, I'm well aware of research connecting privilege awareness to allyship, to social change-oriented action, especially studies conducted in the US clearly show these results. Mm-hmm. However, I'm highly skeptical of the use of this concept and the usefulness of this concept in this region. Mm-hmm. And of course, most of my studies were conducted in Hungary, but also other East Central European countries or countries like Serbia. So maybe, if you don't mind, I'd like to outline why I don't think it's necessarily the most fitting concept if we want to mobilize people for social change. I mean, it may be a useful concept to analyze, describe the situation, but I am not just skeptical in theory. I have had a number of failed experiments that I'm happy to talk about when we tried to mobilize, well, we try to show that people can show higher intentions of solidarity, social change when confronted with privilege, and how we failed this. So if you don't mind, I start by that, because I think maybe it's also more interesting if we don't agree on everything. So while the concept itself is about unearned advantages, or an awareness of these unearned advantages and how becoming aware of them help. And the reason I think we find these rather consistent results, especially in the context of US, especially relations between black and white people, has something to do with their historical relationship, in which through slavery, white Americans actually receive these unearned benefits on the expense of another population. So in that particular relationship, becoming aware of these privileges that come from, well, clearly unearned, because you taking advantage of another population led to that, and becoming aware of it has become part of the culture. This is things students learn in school through generations, and we see a gradual but real change in that respect. And I think the result of that is that when you as a social psychologist, you bring people to the lab, white people, and you make them aware of their privileges, they feel rather guilty, and they want to reduce their guilt. Therefore, they want to do something. They want to reduce the suffering of the other group, and that's measured in all kinds of ways. But the situation is rather different here. First of all, I think I don't need to explain it a lot in this region, that we often feel disadvantaged in our diverse identities, in our national identities. We experience a relative deprivation. Hungary is always concerned about when are we going to catch up with Austria. And now there is a realization that will probably never come. The promise that there was a recent celebration of the 20 years of the joining the European Union, and then the promise was that Hungarians will open cafes in Vienna, but it turned out that they actually serve in the cafes in Vienna, and that's how far we got. So there is a general feeling that we are somehow disadvantaged, we are somehow having difficulty. We have these historical experiences of victimhood. Of course, just a few hundred meters away from the monument here, as a Hungarian, we also need to be aware of the dark sides of our history and perpetratorship, but that's even more difficult. So we have this troubled history. We rarely see ourselves as privileged. And when you confront somebody how privileged you are, like, come on, how could I be privileged? I'm not privileged. There's nothing privileged about me. And confronting people with this idea leads to reactance. So in our studies, we try to use completely apolitical, ahistorical group relationship. For example, we told people that think about your privileges as an able-bodied person, how you don't have to plan your entire day in getting into various buildings, okay? And in a different group, we said, like, think of the disadvantages of disabled people in wheelchairs, how they need to plan their entire day, whether they can get into houses or not. And the result was definitely more helping in the disadvantaged condition, but even in the neutral condition, when we didn't give them any information, there was more helping than in the privilege. Simply people were either not ready, or they really disliked the idea that they have to think of this as privilege. And that comes to another problem, and that may be the definition of privilege. So if we simply define privilege as living without, let's say, discrimination or injustices, okay, that maybe then there's there's a problem with the terminology. Maybe I understand that I live without discrimination in most of my identities. And maybe that's acceptable, but to call it privilege, why do we call it privilege? To have a decent life without discrimination. That should be kind of the minimal human requirement. And so I somehow feel that in a context where we don't culturally endorse this, when we rather, if we think of unearned entitlements, we rather justify it like, but we, through our historical suffering, but we earned it. We can have these entitlements now because we had such a difficult time throughout history. So I somehow feel that there is a general reactance to the term, and we need to acknowledge that as social scientists when we want to mobilize people for social change. But if we think of it to live without discrimination, well, that's what I'm more interested in. And this is maybe the reason I'm invited here, but Tiana would be to say, because we conducted a research study together, and one outcome of that was that very interesting video that I recommend to all of you to watch. It has English subtitles about Roma people trying to rent an apartment in Budapest and how they are faced with rental agencies and private owners rejecting them. And I have to say, they didn't have to make many calls because all the calls were like this. So it wasn't like a single occurrence. It was just their everyday general experience. And this is what this whole study was about, how you can live in a society which not only discriminates you on a daily basis in your most basic encounters with members of the majority population, but also in subtle ways of always questioning who you are, whether you belong here, whether you are even free to define yourself, your identity in particular settings or in general. So I don't know if maybe I can come back to it later, but this is a study we conducted in Serbia, Romania, and Hungary among Roma people, quite a large sample of Roma people. So we're very pleased to get 500 Roma participants in Serbia, same number in Hungary, and a little bit less in Romania. And we basically asked them about these everyday experiences when they were denied the autonomy to define themselves. So, for example, people assume things about me that I don't feel are real or authentic to me. Or people expect me to do things, behave in certain ways, have certain opinions, and I'm not free to have them on, okay, this is not the best definition I can give. There are people here who can probably give better definition. But the idea is that members of minority groups, especially Roma people who are facing discrimination in every area of social life, the people often assume things of them. And these can sometimes be positive, but even that's very limiting when you're not free to define yourself. And basically we found that it has a profound impact on people's identity, whether they feel Serbian, whether they feel Hungarian, whether they feel Romanian. So living together for 400, 500 years, historically a settled community for generations, centuries, and they still don't feel true members of community when they are misrecognized, when they are denied the autonomy to deny themselves. And that's, if you call that privilege, that you can define yourself, yes. But other than that, I feel this is a very minimum for decent living. This is not, shouldn't call it privilege, that you get to define who you are in a society.
Yeah, but in a relative well, when we talk in relative terms, yeah, right, majority is always in some way privileged over.
Of course, in this relation, I don't doubt the concept.
Yeah.
I just doubt that it's useful, because for me, so what's really striking is the discrimination or the misrecognition, and we get empirical support on this large sample of Roma people that this is in fact truly impacting in whether they feel a member of the society.
Yeah, I get it. But then can you maybe tell us a bit more about what would be the motives behind discriminatory behavior, and how, because you conducted the studies both with majority groups and minority groups, right? Your participants were members of majority and minority groups in different studies. In different studies,
it was all Roma people. But most of my studies were conducted among members of the majority
Yes,
population.
so what would be their motives to discriminate against Roma people, and what would be maybe their motives not to discriminate?
I think the second is the more difficult
Yeah.
question. The first question is I guess, the basic principles of social psychology that has studied prejudice for over 100 years. The first studies of social psychology were so-called attitude research, but they were really prejudice research. So we know the many reasons, and we often disguise them as a conflict over resources, or like real conflicts, like the war situations. On the surface, there is always an explicit reason, a justification why I'm entitled to fight this war or to defend myself. But at the end of the day, it's often a struggle for dominance. It's often a struggle for symbolic gains, and so the vicious circle is actually quite easy to explain through how we feel threatened, and we justify that we have to defend ourselves. So I don't want to go into that, because I guess that's kind of so there are a lot of psychological reasons and very mundane reasons, and there is a million papers and books written about it, both from philosophy to history and psychology. But why we would be motivated not to discriminate is, of course, the big question of social psychology trying to reduce prejudice. And how, rather not the reasons why we wouldn't want, well, the reason would be our moral principles, our values, the idea of enlightenment. We want to live in a society that's fair and just, and where everybody has a fair shot at life. So there could be these principles, egalitarian principles, that we want to live up to. So that would be the motivation on the one hand. But how to actually achieve it psychologically, and we often use interventions that either highlight that others are human beings too, they have individual needs, they do belong to other groups, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of similarities between us, which often help to feel empathy, and as soon as we empathize with others, our hostility tend to, decrease, and we try to be nicer. So there could be some moral principles and values that we can change, and we can also create environments where we take the perspective of the others, and we understand that it's hard for them, and we want to do better. We have done some studies in Kosovo and in Hungary, with Roma people, and where we actually found that some of the very basic psychological interventions of intergroup contact, which is kind of the basic way of increasing this liking, empathy, similarity, and so on, and has been found very successful. We found that it's also really important to show that, there is a long history of showing that while contact itself is not enough, you need to have a social environment that endorses it, so you need to have social norms that tell you it's a good thing, and this is basically what we found, that when people, it was so-called, there is a lot of social psychologists sitting here, extended contact, so it's not you who are having a contact, but somebody you know, or somebody who's familiar to you, or similar to you, and that has actually, it's not only useful, because often actual contact is difficult to achieve, but it's also useful, because sometimes it's even more impactful to learn that somebody else has a positive contact, because it also has a message that it's a good thing. And we basically presented it as a typical thing or an atypical thing. And we found that it actually greatly increased the liking of Roma people in both contexts if we presented this so extended contact experience, or not real contact, when it was presented as typical. While most people feel that way. Unfortunately, and that's actually one of the main criticism, I think, of social psychological interventions, why they're not really impactful, and that actually shows that 100 years of research, and we still talk about it, that they're mainly effective on on the level of emotions. So you start liking Roma people more, but that's maybe not enough to change society. You need a little bit more. You need to have a different representation, for example. Acknowledge their identities. That requires more than liking them a little bit more.
And that was actually exactly my next question for you. So do you think that, because I'm also into intergroup relations, and I studied some of those interventions, and my worry, and as I can see that it is your worry as well, is are our psychological interventions enough? So can we change anything by changing individuals, or we need actually some kind of systemic change because you talked about how changing a norm can actually change people's feelings. So can we think about any social change by intervening only on the individual level, or we need to bring it up to higher societal level to have a real change?
I mean, it's a too easy question, of course, to answer, I know. Because obviously not. And but I'd like to answer it on two levels. So one is we need to be critical of social psychological interventions as such, because we sometimes have a very narrow view of humans and human relations. Moreover, we have a tendency to completely overinflate our results, and statistical probability is something that most people don't intuitively understand. But when you manage to change an average from people liking a group on a slightly moderate level to moderate level, that's not changing from dislike to like, but we have a tendency to sell our results as if we could do that. Most of the case we can't. Or if you actually look at what happens in a study, it's usually very modest, the change we can achieve. It's also, I can criticize social psychological interventions on many ways. We don't have a way of actually measuring impact as it happens in real life. What we have a way of doing is to measure it like right after an intervention. Even if it's a school intervention, even if it's a large-scale intervention, we don't follow up with students what happens 2 years later. What we do is, we should be much more modest about what we know about these changes. And the second is, of course, it's not enough to do it on an individual level, but that requires two things. First of all, to understand the connection between institutional, systemic level and the individual. What's the role of the individual in a system, in an institution? It's always how do you say it, like an interactive way. So it's not like, we don't need the individuals. Institutions are run by individuals. So this is you have to treat the micro, the meso, and the macro level together, and it's very difficult, and it usually falls outside the scope of psychology, and there is a so-called implementation science, and I think we don't really want to acknowledge that, but we also should understand that what we find, what we publish in a journal article, has a very, very difficult way of finding its way to an actual implementation. And in medicine, that's an entire science that apparently health. I just listened to a talk, and there was health intervention. Like a medical something that a study shows. On average, it takes 14 years to get implemented. Now that's devastating if you think about it. So there may be a cure out there, and it takes on average 14 years to make it. Maybe not the development of a medicine, more like a procedure. And it even requires a lot of de-implementation. So people have to unlearn a lot of stuff. And I think we all together, we usually write like a paragraph in our at the end of our articles how it will be implemented, but that's extremely naive. So I think one thing to do is to think more about what's the afterlife of our journal articles. I don't say that it's our job to do it, but maybe we need to seek collaborations with people whose job it is. And I think, so I live I don't need to introduce Hungary, I guess. a lot of the interventions, I have done some research with various stakeholders, and what we found that what NGOs can achieve with these interventions are not comparable to any state-level intervention. So when an intervention becomes a state-level intervention, interviews in all schools, that you cannot even compare the impact of NGOs. However, we, as a public university in Hungary, we only have access to this very limited field. We don't have any access to any kind of state-level, implementation. So we have to face the reality of the countries in which we live.
Yeah, and that's why sometimes, usually our interventions just do not work well when there is not political will for reconciliation on a higher level, but only on the individual level. Okay, thank you, Anna. We can come back to some of these topics. Frank, now I would like to talk to you about your research focus. So you focus mostly on white privilege and male privilege, which is that's what I found about you and in your work. And for me, it is always interesting how we talk about usually empowering underprivileged, like women or black people or Roma people, but we rarely talk about facing the privileged with their privileges and facing them with how they can profit from inequality and what happens then. So maybe we can start with that. What happens when we confront men with male privilege, and is there any difference regarding who is the confronter? So is it a man talking about male privilege to other men, or is it a woman talking about male privilege to men?
Yeah, thanks. I think I will come back to a few things you said, because I think we agree on more things than you think. But to this specific question, because it's related to a study I did with colleagues in Marburg, I should also add, before I answer the question, that I'm, as of this month, affiliated with the University of Klagenfurt in Austria, and I think I should mention this if I'm at a public forum. We confronted people, men, not all of them were white, I guess, with male privilege, and we had to base this kind of study on a very selected kind of literature base, which was coming from the US mainly, and which was also mainly talking about white privilege. So we kind of extrapolated a lot, because it's different inequalities, it's different systems, it's different countries, different contexts. I was interested, based on I think personal interactions, of whether the advantage group, when the advantage group confronts the advantage group, or the disadvantage group confronts the advantage group, whether this changes anything in the reaction. And what we found, and this is, I'm cautious to say this is what happens, because these are, to put it in context, 3 experimental online studies that were done during COVID, and as part of my PhD. So if I say this is what happens, this is what we found, this must not be true. But we found the tendency that there was actually no difference in the level of actual acceptance of privilege. Men were similarly accepting of privilege, whether they were confronted by a fellow man or a woman. But the mechanisms were a little bit different between these two things. So the women tended to elicit more threat. Men felt more threatened by privilege confrontations that women gave them. And also women were in greater danger of facing backlash. So in a sense, this confirmed some of Anna's concerns with confronting privilege, because it can lead to backlash. We also found some effects, though, that it also made men sometimes react more strongly with pro-egalitarian intentions. And we had also in qualitative data where they wrote down what they thought about a text that confronted them. So this was not only measures, they also had more feelings of approach sometimes, if you compare it to control conditions. So that's basically the answer. to this question. There's different paths. And I think importantly, and maybe there's another important part, because the question was also what happens when we confront people with privilege. And now this is also very difficult, because again, I think all of this goes back to one kind of big paper that was published in the US by US authors, and it was about white privilege. And they found or claim that when people are confronted with privilege, that they will react either with this kind of meritocratic threat, is what they call it. They feel like their status is being taken away. The legitimacy of their status was being taken away. So you haven't earned, or the feeling of I haven't really earned what I worked for. Apparently, it's just because I'm white or something like this. And the other part of it was this group image threat, where they said, okay, now you want me to feel bad, or others look at me in a bad light. And they found that these kind of things predict, or claim that these kinds of things predict the outcomes, like trying to dismantle inequality, reducing inequality, distancing from the inequality, from the privilege, and saying, well, I haven't really profited from it myself because I faced so many hardships, or denying privilege altogether, or backlash, and these kinds of things. And I have a bit of a problem with that personally, because it, and this also relates to maybe some of what you said, because this is a very good evidence of this kind of sometimes, and I know there's some social psychologists there because you said this, and I know that's also interesting to social psychologists, and maybe just generally people interested in academia, there's this strong American bias in there. Even though the authors claim it in the title, it's an American, how Americans cope with privilege. In the text, they come to this conclusion that their model is a socio-cultural model of dealing with or coping with advantage in Western industrialized democratic context, which excludes maybe Hungary, I guess. I don't know the self-definition. Western? Okay. That's the EU bonus. Yeah, it's true.
It's an old classification, maybe.
Yeah. I don't really like this.
We are out.
What I meant is they think that it should work in Germany. And another study that's not yet published, because I think it has some problems in trying to work with this concept in Germany, because we tried to adapt it and did find that none of the things that they proposed would happen, happened. And in our study with men, we also measured group image threat, where the men look at them, think they are being made to feel bad. And we found that this, contrary to the original claim of the model, is not a positive predictor of accepting privilege, but a negative predictor. So it leads to rejection, to backlash. And actually what is positive is this kind of feeling like my moral values are being threatened, and I want to be, they don't align with my moral values. And I think that's where we might, I don't know if we disagree on this, but I think this is where privilege confrontations can help when they're done well, when they trigger you at your moral senses, basically, and make you aware that you are living in a system that is not according to what you would like it to be. However, you need to have some preparation for this, because not like if you're disadvantaged in many other contexts, I don't think that you will care about this at all, because you're still in a competition about resources. Why should you take a step back and be the better person and then still don't have anything at all?
And is there any difference when we talk about different intergroup contexts? Like, is there any difference in the reactions on like white privilege relative to male privilege, or or reaction to being privileged, to facing the fact that you are privileged, is in some way unique?
Quite honestly, I think the honest answer is we don't know yet. There's not enough comparative research between these contexts. It's important to acknowledge that there might be psychological things that are similar across these contexts, like reactions, psychological reactions that are generalizable. These contexts are very different. Like even between countries, the historical origin of racism is different. The historical origins of sexism might be a bit more universal in these Western countries, and then it is like contextual, like at the time point different. So we would need to be much more informed about how these contextual effects, and that's what I want to do more in the future, and which is also part of the white privilege project I did, is trying to contextualize it and actually the specific historical relation. But we don't know yet really whether and how it is different. This is a short answer.
Yeah, and I have to say that I really can feel that that fact that when researchers in the US study something, then they generalize it, and it can be like generalized to everything, and then we do the same thing in Europe, and they say no, it's not relevant or similar thing, and that is maybe one example of how we as pretty privileged academic people face different structural inequalities. But maybe now we can talk a bit more about allyship. So when we know that we are privileged, there is definitely something that we can do to, to do something for the sake of equality. So my question for you would be: could confrontation with privilege be a step towards the allyship with unprivileged, or it rather backfires?
Well, I think this is an open debate.
Okay. Let's debate then.
And also, again, generally, I don't know if there's a simple answer to this. I think this is very much depending on context. What we found is that it can actually have a positive effect, that people at least say they are more likely to engage in collective action. We also have a lot of non-relevant effects, zero effects, that are where it's not really doing something. There's some backlash to it. What we do find, though, and that's something we did and are trying to publish currently, is we interviewed privileged activists and asked them about what they think about privilege, what is their, like, we just went the other way. We went to the allies and asked them, how do they think of privilege? What is their social representation? What do they associate with privilege? And then we also asked them how this relates to their activism, quite bluntly. And what we found is that almost all of the activists that we interviewed actually mentioned privilege before we came to ask them about it. So we asked them about the story, why did you become politically active? And the majority of them said, at some point I realized that this is unfair, this is unequal, and I felt guilty, I felt responsibility, I felt I need to do something. And this was also the origin of some of the privilege research I did afterwards, because I was kind of inspired by this, okay, how can we make people care about it more? And I think the most promising part to make people care about it and then also get politically engaged seems to be witnessing discrimination. Witnessing how others, how the discriminated are being discriminated, either by interventions in a university, there's some studies there, or by being discriminated themselves in another identity. And realizing, okay, this is for all of us, it's not good. It's not something I do out of charity for the outgroup, but it's something that I do for the whole society. And also for myself, because well-being also correlates with inequality negatively. That's. I realize I'm talking very long, so I'm trying to keep them short.
Thank you. And I really like that you mentioned that this is not charity, but rather solidarity. And I think that maybe that is something we should all think about when we talk about when we talk and think about helping others who are maybe discriminated more than us. That it's not a charity but solidarity to in order to build like a better society. But we can go back to that later. Thank you, Majda. You also study gender-related privilege, but in the context of wild neoliberalism, let's say. And maybe you could tell us more about. You actually study privilege in terms of care jobs, is it the term? Maybe we can start with how does the current economic system prevent us from reaching gender equality and from, fighting with privilege. And then maybe you can tell us more about gender inequalities regarding, well, the concept of care in private sphere and in public sphere.
Wow, big question.
Well, I can partialize it.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you for this festival. I think the program is amazing, and actually I feel privileged to be here. Talking about care, I always say care work is not a job as any other job, but it's a kind of the job. It's a job which is a precondition for any other job. It is a job which enables social reproduction and production, because there is no production without reproduction of labor force. And care is also a terrain of diverse inequalities. Generally, care flow runs from women to men, from poor to rich. So we have gender inequalities, we have class inequalities in care work, and from ethnic minorities and racialized people to majorities. So we also have racialized inequalities here. And usually in care, all these three regimes of inequalities intersect. In practice, it means that usually poor women, racialized women, perform a bulk of care work needed for reproduction of society. So it's no wonder that care is also a terrain of fighting for equality. On the other side of the flow of care, there is something that feminist ethic of care, John Tronto, for instance, name privileged irresponsibility. And care is also lately becoming a terrain of the alliances between ecological movements, trade unionists, gender equality activists, anti-racist activists who are trying to imagine and develop alternatives to the neoliberalism and the current situation. I mean, an exit out of this multiplayer crisis in which we found. But yeah, speaking about care, for instance, if I start with the private sphere, because I think that I mean, generally speaking, equal share in care between men and women is a kind of precondition for any kind of inequality in society. And I think that in formal, I mean in private sphere, in the family, we can see some progress, let's say, especially in the field of fatherhood. We can see how something called active fatherhood, men are involved in childcare, the share of single fathers is increasing, at least in Slovenia, the share of sharing parenthood after divorce is increasing, and what is important here is that this is and this is related to the previous discussion between identity and structure. This is stimulated, heavily stimulated by the state. For instance, in Slovenia, with non-transferable paternity leave, which is fully paid 30 days. On the European level, with this is also the politics, I mean, to which should become a standard and so on. And I mean, this politics was a kind of bottom down. It was not grassroots, it was bottom down politics, but it is successful. I mean, between 80 and 90% of men in Slovenia take up paternity leave. Of course, here too, we cannot homogenize men. Here too, we can observe that some can afford that, others are not. Our research with men in precarious employment clearly showed that for instance, those who have short-term contracts, they are afraid to take paternity leave because they dare that they will not get the prolonged contract because they will not fit the norm of carefree, totally available employee. Also, social rights are linked to standard full-time permanent employment. I mean, paternity leave, parental rights like parental leave, paternity leave, maternal leave, holidays, sick leave, and so on. So these are a kind of structural inequalities which represent barrier for some men to be involved fathers. But yeah, some people think also about the question, is gender equality a genuine motive behind introducing and encouraging men to be more involved in care? Is this a genuine motive on the level of the politics? And some people, Nancy Fraser, for instance, or an important sociologist and feminist from Serbia, Marina Blagojević, I'm sure some of you know her very well. They observed and commented that neoliberalism very well profits from caring masculinity. I mean, neoliberalism is an economy which fosters long working days, competitiveness, continuous growth, flexibility, intensity of labor, and in this blurring of boundaries between private life and professional life, meaning that it very much reduces our time and energy for self-care, for care for the family and for the community. And at the same time, neoliberal system reduces social welfare, meaning care services, public kindergartens, nursing homes, services for older and disabled, and so on. And with this, neoliberalism marketized, commodified, and privatized care, meaning that care is becoming our personal issue and personal problem. And of course, the whole family should be involved in care and in paid work to survive such a condition. And that's why Marina Blagojević said that caring masculinity can be seen also from the perspective of the appropriation of care as a tool for adapting men to the neoliberal conditions. And speaking about professional care, there is not so much evidence that men participate more. I mean, it is an issue on the political level for many reasons, but not so much in practice. For instance, in Slovenia, we have 3% of men among kindergarten teachers, which is really a pity because they could be very good role models. Very few men in elder care, but in nursing, the numbers are growing. It is about 15%. And of course, there are structural and identity reasons. Paid work, status, payment, I mean salary, are important norms of being a kind of real man, and being different from women is on the identity level a crucial norm. And being involved for men in a feminized terrain of care work, which is devaluated economically and socially, actually means being in conflict with norms of masculinity and risking marginalization and from peers. Yeah. But men also face, and this our research show that men also face in care work different, I would say, barriers, which are related to gender stereotypes. So they can be questioned. Can men also have competencies to be caring at all? After all, this is a kind of a natural women trait. They are also over-sexualized. For instance, in kindergarten, they are accused of being sexual predators, pedophiles. In nursing, they are assumed to be gay. In elder care, they are declined from the users, who are mostly women because of the gender-specific aging, that they want to have a female caregiver, and so on. So this is one side of the story. On the other side, research also shows that when they take up care work, professional care work, they very often also retain patriarchal privileges in the sense that they, for instance, they take up positions which are a kind of heroic. They are drivers of emergency car, or they work in intensive care or in emergency care, or they are linked to, they are engaged in a kind of caring sector which are more low touch but high tech, meaning technological caring sectors. And these are all sectors with higher salaries and the position which are in line with gender stereotypes. Men like technically competent, problem solver, rational, active, and so on and so on. And it's also very clearly evident from the research that a glass elevator effect is very strong when men are engaged in care, meaning that they are fast promoted on the managerial position and on the top paid positions. And although they are few, the gender pay gap in care sector is approximately 20% because of these hierarchies. So what I want to say is that situation is not straightforward black and white, and it's not something that is progressing, but is something that goes back and forth, and that it is complex in a way that it can partly be linked to gender equality, but on the other hand, it can also serve to neoliberalism, because capitalism proved to be very smart in appropriating progressive ideas. And also, men in professional care should be viewed from the perspective of macroeconomic. Transformation of industrial economy into more a kind of precarious, feminized, service-based economy, which demands a lot of emotional work, a lot of soft skills, cooperation, empathy, and so on, put especially working class men and young men into a kind of hard situation. It's hard to find job. It's hard to survive. It's hard to see the future and prospects. And this situation was, and we see it clearly, it is highly mobilized and instrumentalized by right-wing politics. We saw this now in the election. We see this in Manosphere and Rotate, for instance. We see this in Thursday. Friedrich Ebert Foundation released results of the newest research on young people aged between 15 and 29 in Southeast Europe, in 12 countries of Southeast Europe. And one of the most remarkable and worrying result was that a strong shift toward the right-wing politics for young people in general, but much more, in much higher proportion for boys, meaning that gender political gap is growing. And young men, not just in this part of Europe, I would say all over Europe, are becoming more kind of radicalized, nationalistic, chauvinistic, and homophobic. And yeah, this is a kind of pessimistic last word, but perhaps we will develop it in another way.
Yeah, thank you. But I would just like to ask you about this gender political gap, because it was, now we have the results for this part of Europe, but like less than a year ago, the first results for, I think, Western Europe or the US were published, and then there was really a strong debate on social media about what are, why did it happen? Because there is a tendency for girls and young women to become more progressive,
more
and
liberal, yeah.
Or liberal, yeah. And for boys and young men to become more conservative. So maybe you can give us your view on it. Why?
Yeah, I tried a little bit to indicate it, but actually, I mean, if we take a look incels on the social media, on the incels as a group in the manosphere. Incels is a kind of short abbreviation for involuntary celibacy. Yeah. And some research of incels clearly showed that it is very much linked to the structural economic situation. And why this hits boys, because I mean these are mostly young men. Why all white working class men? Why this hits men more than women? My answer would be because men are losing privileges here. I mean, women were not in privileged position before. Precarity, short-term contracts, dependency were and still is always the situation of women, while men are really losing privileges now. But in terms of gender equality, I would say, and this is again not optimistic, that we are becoming closer, but in bed. Not in I mean, not to be stronger, more empowered, more, I don't know, prosperous, but we are becoming equal in precarity, in insecurity.
Yeah, it's yeah. Go on, Frank.
I don't know, is this allowed?
Yeah, of course it is. I was about to give you all words now,
Okay,
so
sorry.
we can
Okay.
discuss about everything.
You did now, thanks.
Yeah, go for it.
Just very quickly, because you said negative outlook and positive outlook, and you compared the two. And I just thought you said responsibility or privilege of irresponsibility or something, right? The privilege of not having to care.
Privileged irresponsibility.
One of the I want to set against this a positive outlook where I think instead of trying to understand why everything goes better and better, and continues to get worse, I thought we could also look at why are we thinking about care as something negative. Isn't instead of the privilege not to care, that's not really a privilege, because I think there's a lot of societies, there's a lot of history where humans organized themselves, where care was actually something that is very valued. And care is a very important feature of the world, and I think with the neoliberalism, I think it hits the nail on the head. I just want to say that because I think it's important sometimes.
Yeah, I think that this is again this comes from the liberal notion on citizenship, which is related to a kind of being independent, autonomous, which is shaped according to the androcentric norm of independency, autonomy, and workfare. Workfare in terms of paid work. And in that sense, care as unproductive, work. I cannot imagine more productive work than care. But care as so-called unproductive work in capitalist terms is, of course, not part of the citizenship defined in neoliberal, in classical liberal theory of citizenship.
And it is because it is unpaid, or at least underpaid, right? Well,
because it doesn't produce profit.
Yes. And maybe before we, thank you, Majdom. And before we give the audience the word, I would maybe just like to mention that, when we talked about systemic change that is necessary to to actually do anything, systemic willingness as well, at least. But then you might have mentioned those state stimulation for paid paternity leave. Thank you. Yes, and it seems to me. We do have it here in Serbia as well, but it's and some fathers do use it, but it still seems to me that it is maybe an example of more cosmetic change or measure than the real one, because not many fathers do use it, and because there is a gender pay gap, and then when you choose which parent would go to the paternal leave, it will usually be mother because she earns less. So I don't know. I wanted to wrap the discussion up in some optimistic way, but in optimistic tone. But it doesn't seem to me that it is possible.
If I have a few more sentences, but not long, not many. When you were talking about giving up privileges, especially for men, I think critical studies of men and masculinity is it's a kind of discipline within the gender studies, and especially, globally, you have many organizations who are, men's organizations who are pro-feminist and fighting for gender equality and for reducing male privileges. For instance, Pro Mundo, White Ribbon. In Germany, there is Dissens. In Austria, there are some men. In Spain, there are quite some such organizations in which men are active. They work with men in the direction of giving up privileges, patriarchal privileges, and embracing gender equality. And what is the strategy in all this movement? It is it is not moralizing or I don't know. It is confronting men with the fact that their privileges have also costs. For instance, they have political power, economic power, leisure time, more authority, and many other privileges. But on the other hand, the lifespan is much shorter for men. They have much more problems with suicide, addictions, alcoholism, overworking. They are not so. They have problems with relationships, with being involved in families, and so on. Because they have to be strong all the time and on the top. Rising awareness about this. I mean, this is what feminism did in the second wave of feminism. Self-awareness about our situation and what hinder us in our situation. So they do this, and I think that they are quite successful in this.
Yeah. Okay. So then maybe there can be some way of change. Maybe maybe we can now give the word to the audience, and then I will have one last question for all of you before we finish. So if anyone wants to ask or to engage into discussion, you're feel free to. Yeah.
No, I really don't mean to cut the audience.
No,
I just
of
thought
course.
like a
Sorry.
very short sentence.
Yeah.
So and that's the positive side of it. That basically the backlash, these worrying data about young men turning more conservative. I mean, all of it is a sign of social change. This is a very natural reaction to actual social change. What happens is that members of privileged groups or groups that have historically benefited from a certain status relations feel threatened when things change. And or people feel threatened from change, even if they were disadvantaged. Simply change is threatening. And so basically no social change occurs in a linear way.
Of course.
And this was a rapid change. It happened within like very short, period, a matter of one or at most 2 generations. So simply, I think it's a reflection of how profound social change was in terms of gender relations. And so we should. I'm really not for optimism, but I think that needs to be stated.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So yeah, go.
I totally believe that people, let's say someone who's in a wheelchair has every right as I do. He has every right to work as I do. I'm not in a wheelchair, but he is just as equal as me. I would still not hire that person to fix my roof, for example. And my question is, does privilege and lack of privilege and discrimination ever interlude or hit a concrete wall when it comes to, what's known as, in legal terms, the hand of God or higher power thing? Like, does that ever, interlude with your research and your work towards privilege against discrimination and so on? I don't know if I was clear.
Okay. So
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's a question that can never be fully answered, or we will never agree on the final answer, and it's really context specific. But I do think in particular situations, especially concerning one group and another, we can identify discrimination without, necessarily requiring sameness or, we acknowledging the differences, acknowledging the special needs of a particular group. that doesn't necessarily mean that, shouldn't mean that you automatically discriminate them. But sometimes it's a fine line. I mean, I'm sure we don't all agree on what women need to do in order to show that they are equal. I think we may have different ideas about that, or values, or tastes, and what counts as discrimination, or I don't know, sexual objectification of women, and what counts as empowerment. So I think these are interesting debates, but I don't think we necessarily, I mean, we can definitely say you don't need to send a person in a wheelchair to the roof to show that you don't discriminate them. I mean, there should be better ways of showing that, if I understood you.
Yes. Thank you. So, are there other questions? So yeah, go on.
Well, thank you very much for the insights. I was just wondering, what can we as both scientists, practitioners, but also everyday people do? Because we also had kind of sometimes a pessimistic voice about the limitation of our scientific findings, and I agree with many of them. So I would like to know, what do you think, what would be the way, both for scientists, for practitioners, for us, to change the situation?
Well, maybe I can answer this. I think one of the important things to do, but that's also a personal situation where I'm in, is the question of redefining or defining, as a researcher, your actual researcher identity. Do you want to engage personally in this social change topic? Do you want to contribute to social change? And that was part of the topic on the first day, which was very interesting. And concretely, I think, what can we do as like everyone? I think it's generally not losing hope. And I think that hope nowadays comes from actually thinking about alternatives to patching the ship while we run down towards the waterfall, and not continue patching it until we all reach equality and then burn, basically. But thinking about new ways of trying to arrange a society. Because what currently happens, in my view, and that's not very scientific, because you also asked as a layperson, so to speak. But in my view, there's a lot of issue currently with a loss of hope, and the lack of hope that also fuels right-wing populist and very libertarianist, anarcho-capitalist politics that is very just me and my personal freedom, and it shouldn't be walled off by anyone else. It's just be me, and I should be doing whatever I like, and nobody can interfere with this. And I think this is a consequence of this path we're headed. And I think we need another idea to set against this, and preferably a new idea, not one of the old ideas warmed up again, but a new idea of how to respond to this. And I think that's currently, in my opinion, that gives me most hope, is the creativity of people, how they can organize a society, and that there's more to, I don't know, capitalism and socialism, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Maybe, yeah, it actually reminds me on, we mentioned that on the notion of solidarity, and how, how current system forces us to be like independent individuals who can do whatever they want and stuff like that, and then we lose that idea of solidarity, which might be, well, in my opinion, it is maybe the most important for building something better for everyone. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
If I can answer that?
Yeah, of course.
Because I actually noted it, I just didn't want to take more time. It's also a little bit in response to you, or kind of supporting what you were saying. We have recently done a study in Hungary using a representative sample because we are trying to set up a so-called solidarity index of society. I want to show in a longitudinal pattern. Hopefully when I'm retired, people will continue looking at the pattern. It takes a long time to create a pattern. But what we found in this first phase of the study, that we identified two paths to solidarity. And it was solidarity with disadvantaged members of disadvantaged groups without defining, and then we asked people, who did you have in mind? Which was already quite interesting. But basically, I think it's kind of also an optimistic line. So there is one path which supports this privilege concept to some extent, because I think in order for a privilege awareness to work, you need to have a very secure identity. You need to be sure of yourself and to feel like even if you're confronted with your privilege, you're still okay. What can I do about it? That you need to have this security. So what we found that this identity vulnerability, which we measured on a national level, so those who felt that Hungarians had been victimized in history, who felt so-called collective narcissism, so they felt had an inflated sense of identity, we are great. However, that needs to be reinforced by everybody, and somehow it's not acknowledged by the world. They don't see our greatness for some reason, so this kind of idea. So we found that people who scored higher on these scales, so who had more of these, they were most prone to those conservative ideologies that prevent you from showing solidarity. So those ideologies that say it's okay to have a society in which some people are up and others are down. So this kind of identity fragility or vulnerability was at the core of it, and it prevented people from solidarity. And this is a huge problem. But on the bright side, we also found that those people who had felt some kind of moral responsibility, I want to be a decent human being, I care for others, I'm responsible for others, and that was completely independent of this identity vulnerability. So that can happen to people with high or low identity vulnerability equally, and that predicted solidarity. So of course, we have to focus on this problem of identity vulnerability in order to create solidarity in society across groups with disadvantaged groups. But there is also an alternative path that you can basically build on people's moral responsibility, that we still care for others. We don't walk about completely, disengaged and disinterested in the fate of others. So I thought that was a good lesson, and we want to do some interventions to see whether there is a way of increasing that and reducing the vulnerability.
Yeah, that seems to be something that might work. Do we have maybe some other questions from the audience? If not, I would just like to ask you one last short question. Well, you started answering it without being questioned, but being asked. But maybe we can wrap up with how to be a good ally, or how to find, what would make people good allies to underprivileged groups, because we all are in some ways privileged, in some other we are underprivileged, and we probably everyone in this room considers themselves allies with some underprivileged group, but maybe we can finish with what is a good ally, how to be a good ally to underprivileged. So who would like to start? You can, Anna, maybe you or
start, but it's a whole new topic. And this is also a line of research that I have been doing with some international collaborators. Some of my PhD students are working on it, because how to be an ally is one question, or how to show solidarity, but how to be a good ally is a whole new story. And I'm recommending another video to you that we conducted with Roma activists who actually talked about allyship, and they were very, very critical of what they consider a good ally. It's also there is a Spanish two Slovak and one Hungarian Roma activist on it, and they all talk about allyship. And first of all, they don't talk about majority members. For them, allies are mostly people from other disadvantaged groups. So that's also our assumption, that members of the majority are great allies, of course, because we think we are good allies, because we somehow have power. But actually, maybe we are not the most welcome allies, so that's something to think about. But our research is mostly about how to be an ally to actually bring about change, even if it is at the cost of my position somehow changing. I'm not saying losing status, because I think that's more complicated. Or you just want to be an ally to show off because it's trendy. This is in line with what all your friends think is a cool thing to do, and so we find that the psychologically they are quite different, and so I think good allyship need to come about in some kind of collaboration, dialogue with the people you want to be an ally for, and to understand that sometimes it's stepping back. Sometimes it's doing something extremely boring. We find, for example, in the context of Ukrainian refugees helpers, we found a lot of people showing a lot of solidarity at first, but some of these volunteers were very frustrated when the organizations told them to fill out Excel sheets. But that was the most helpful thing they could do at the point. So understanding that it's not heroism, it's not about how you show off, but to understand that sometimes it's the mundane, everyday tasks and that you have to engage in, and maybe you're not the ideal ally, maybe you're not the ally they are looking for. You can still, be firm on your values and live a life that's like that, but understand that if you're not a welcome ally.
Yeah, that you can support, but you do not have to be an ally if you're not a good ally, but you can still support the cause, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's really difficult, especially when there is a lot of emotions involved and historical bad experiences. It's not easy. You don't want to speak for the other group, but you do have something to say. How do you do that? So I think it's quite a challenging job to be a good ally in some contexts. In others, it's relatively simple.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that made me want to do my research was the skepticism about this idea that threatening your group's image will make you be a good ally. Because what this will do is you will do political action maybe that covers you in a good light, which is mainly going to be donations or what you call what's trendy, so that you are seen by the disadvantaged groups, by other peers, as a positive person or as an example of a positive identity. And as soon as the pressure fades, you will also stop doing anything. So that was my main problem with this. And I think that leads to a part of the question that you didn't ask, but it's also important, is what is a bad ally? And I think there's a lot of things that you can also read on and research about the negative impact of allies in social movements, and about the not really positive impact of the presence of allies for social movements. So they're not even more effective when allies are present. There's recently something on that. So it's kind of a little bit bleak for allies to identify themselves in terms of the effectiveness they bring to the cause, and especially because they can also bring some danger to the cause. But I think this is a very good point, that talking to other people that are not facing the discrimination that you are in this moment talking about is, for me, one of the best ways to do the allyship, because you kind of prepare society by dissipating this new moral norm of we shouldn't discriminate, we shouldn't have this inequality, it's not okay, it's bad for us all, to make it easier for when the fight comes. There's maybe a little bit less resistance the more people prepare against this resistance, so to speak. That's what I would say is maybe a good way of defining allyship. There's also a different definition between allyship and friendship. And that's also important for your self-definition. Are you a friend of a person, or are you an ally of a person?
Or both.
Or both.
Yeah, thank you. Maida, maybe.
Yes, I think that perhaps feminist epistemology has some important lessons how to go on with this. And the most important, I think, is to give the voice the people who are discriminated, who are in hard situations, and that they can define by themselves what is the problem for them, that they can speak for themselves, not that expert policymakers and whoever, European Union, I don't know, the state, or NGOs are talking for them, but that they can speak for themselves, that they can define the way to go on by themselves, and then to support them and fight with them in that.
Thank you. Thank you. So maybe now we can finish the discussion. It was really a pleasure for me to talk to you about these really, really important topics. And I have to say that I learned much from this discussion. I hope that you all learned something new from this discussion. So thank you all. Thank you for your attention. And I would just like to invite you to the gig concert of Kal Band, right? Which is in Guerrilla Bar at 9. So see you there. Thank you.